Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're doing something therapeutic, combining the calming sound of a thunderstorm with 10 of our most unsettling, long-form stories to help your mind slip into the darkness while your body unwinds. If this fusion of fear and relaxation feels like your kind of therapy, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss more long nights of narrative dread. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain wrap around you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. Working as a system administrator in a multi-million-dollar data center in downtown Dallas, Texas, felt like being the lone pastor in a massive, sterile temple. I worked a total graveyard shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., completely alone in a vast, climate-controlled server field composed of thousands of blinking, humming, silent steel boxes, all dedicated to the constant, rhythmic churn of global finance. The atmosphere was a world unto itself, Arctic cold, a total physical whiteness of light, and the deafening, perpetual WHRR fan noise of the air conditioning. The only constant presence of nature was the intense, deafening sound of winter hail and rain hammering the sheer, aluminum siding walls of the massive building, a brutal contrast to the silence inside the steel. The oddity began when the city's power grid failed. It was 3:45 a.m., and a massive, unforecasted pressure storm caused a catastrophic structural failure at the main power substation. With a single, colossal thunk, the emergency lighting grid in the entire data center failed completely, instantly plunging the massive hall into a perfect, silent, suffocating darkness. The powerful, relentless fan noise, the only sound that anchored me to reality, dropped instantly into a haunting, total silence. Only the tiny, flashing red LED indicators on the main power modules of the servers provided any pinpoint light in the sudden, deep, consuming darkness. I scrambled immediately to the main manual generator switch, but before my safety sequence could begin, in the oppressive heat and fear, the main terror started to unfold. All around the silent, dark hall, the thousands of internal server power units, all of them supposed to be sealed, offline, and permanently silent after a major outage, started to activate. Not with a full, integrated roar, but with a rhythmic, high-pitched, insistent click. Thousands of metallic clicks, in perfect, rapid, organized succession, spread out across the silent floor, the sound of every hard drive motor in the entire floor firing up instantly and rapidly, all synchronized and organized into one massive, controlled sonic event. The profound, rhythmic clicking sound, high-pitched and organized, replaced the deafening silence of the previous moment. This entire silent array of hardware was completely awake. I was paralyzed under the terror of the single power loss. This kind of complete initialization required a physical internal connection release that took full human muscle. Yet, the clicking continued with frightening precision. I slowly made my way out from behind the black cabinet rows, using the dim light of my emergency flashlight. I saw the display monitors, thousands of them spanning the ceiling-high racks, which had been blank and black when the power failed only a moment prior, were now all spontaneously turning on. The screen light wasn't a corporate logo. It was a perfect, organized field of the sickly white-green hue of a massive, archaic, single DOS prompt. My brain screamed the word impossible with terrifying clarity. These systems were supposed to be permanently isolated analog units. And then, the visuals came, consuming all my residual logic. All around the terrifyingly bright, chaotic green-lit hall, on 1,000 synchronized, small screens, the content was exactly the same. The monitors were all displaying immense, full-screen photographs. The pictures were not the usual corporate graphics I had last left. They were black and white, highly detailed images from my personal life, childhood photos. My 8th grade math class photo was here. The blurry image of my long-dead family dog was next, and the intense, static, deep black and white image of a faded, forgotten toy model plane I had played with in my first sandbox as a 3-year-old child dominated the next row of terminals. Every internal system in the massive, powerful, global network data center was completely, silently running on an invisible, non-electrical grid, dedicated entirely to projecting my single, 7-year-old life memory. I stumbled back, my hands trembling near the heavy titanium cooling coils. This had to be an existential mistake, a catastrophic digital accident fueled by extreme physical trauma. I grabbed the nearest monitor's keyboard, smashed the Ctrl-Alt-DL sequence repeatedly, but not a single screen blinked in response. The massive digital array was completely under the organized, non-human control of a single purpose. The fan array, which had been silent before, abruptly resumed, slowly spooling up into a new, single, organized drone, a terrible, low, rhythmic, profound hum that was slightly higher in pitch, sounding exactly like the single collective song of 1,000 men chanting in unison. The visual was overwhelming. The whole center was now chanting and displaying my memory entirely. I threw my security card at the screen and ran in a blind panic straight for the front exit cage, crashing hard into the massive, high-security stainless steel door. I pulled down the heavy steel handle, but the door remained permanently sealed. I was locked in with my memories. I looked back desperately at the immense rows of staring, silent, green-lit screens. The image had changed from the photos. Now, the screens were static black, displaying only a single, large row of repeating, green numerical code sequences. The thousands of screens all ran a parallel, massive, coherent wave of precise, repetitive numbers that rapidly flooded the empty hall with cold light. And in the very center of the total chaos, on a small, isolated, central terminal screen that had completely failed its backup battery, a single word glowed, intensely and ominously white, against the total black background. Access. The silent glow of that single terminal completely undid my sanity. I slammed my fists repeatedly against the black glass of the security cage to no effect, abandoning the logic altogether. I know a simple, awful truth now. The server room glitch was never about the physical power grid failure. It was the deliberate, organized release of the data's true master, a pervasive psychic demon that was permanently sealed in the digital architecture, feeding on information and collective effort. The physical power failure was the signal of its immense, singular power, and all of my childhood memories had been its way of confirming the entire system's focus. It had read every single piece of its users' available information, consumed all the system's human memory, and found the access point to the digital core. No amount of money could get me back. I survived the night, hiding under a cooling pipe, completely silent, until the full power grid restored itself in the morning. I quit the job immediately. I don't look at old childhood photos anymore. The thought terrifies me that the total collapse of the digital world will not be marked by an intense, visible technological catastrophe, but by the ultimate psychological intrusion, a massive, coordinated, chanting song of pure, perfect memory, all dedicated to projecting the deepest, most isolated images of my soul back onto the world where I can never fully outrun my past. Story 2. Up on the Maine coastline, after a fierce mid-Atlantic storm, the water is treacherous, and the ocean never forgets. I found the magnificent, cold artifact 3 seasons ago, an absolute, simple, beautiful piece of forgotten, powerful metal, 3 hours before sunrise on the deepest stretch of the deserted coastline near Booth Bay. The enormous, coastal rain that had battered the area for 36 hours had finally pulled back into a continuous, heavy drizzle, leaving a chaotic, massive pile of old wood, trash, and exposed debris scattered across the high tide line. I'm a dedicated relic hunter, specializing in old shipwrecks, always searching for the perfect piece of unique, forgotten material that speaks of deep human history. The moment I saw the massive, perfectly formed, antique brass basin, the size of a water basin, polished and gleaming despite centuries of exposure, I knew I had found the profound terror. It was the shipwrecked beachcomber's final testament. The basin was heavy, perfectly spherical, and intensely cold, radiating an unnerving chill that seemed to defy the cold sand itself. There was no corrosion, no writing, no discernible mark that would betray its unique point of final origin. The second my raw, cold hand made full physical contact with its icy surface, a massive, crushing, high-frequency whoosh of dizziness and vertigo hit my entire nervous system, slamming me to my entire physical body right back down onto the cold, wet sand beneath. The intense surge of physical disequilibrium passed instantly, leaving me trembling, but completely awake and aware. I knew I had found an artifact embedded with a profound, terrifying moment of sustained, agonizing human trauma. I immediately brought the massive, strange relic home, carefully separating it from my simple, wood-heated coastal cottage. The anomaly began early that very night. My home felt entirely cold. The whole ambient volume of the main room, despite the immense heat from the furnace, simply declined in temperature every hour the bowl sat there, positioned on my heavy mahogany desk near the massive bay window facing the constant, aggressive drumming of the coastal drizzle. The massive metal artifact was winning the subtle, intense war against the simple external energy source of my own heating system, slowly, patiently transferring every single available thermal unit into its intense, cold brass composition. The terror did not stop with the absence of simple heat. It moved to the full elimination of light. Over the following week, the air around the pewter basin became a permanently localized phenomenon, a terrifying, perpetual light suck. Even with every high-powered lamp in the living room entirely turned on, any object placed within the half-meter radius of the bowl appeared strangely, instantly washed out, devoid of all color, reflection, and visible pigment, as if the energy was being slowly, methodically absorbed by the bowl's simple, ancient surface into its deep, cold core. When the constant coastal rain hammered the glass outside, making the entire internal scene an immense landscape of black and silver wetness, the brass container seemed to glow, a faint, intense, sickly orange hue emanating from its polished depths, illuminating a single, permanent, massive, waterlogged black smudge of old matter that formed on the antique wooden surface beneath it. My breakdown came in the absolute quiet of the 3 a.m. full core of a new coastal storm. I was sitting rigidly in my heavy reading chair, listening intently to the relentless rush of the powerful sound of the storm, consumed by the intense, deep physical cold that had claimed the interior of my small house. Suddenly, a high, intense, terrible metallic screaming sound started abruptly out in the back of the small corridor. The sound was not a human scream, but the absolute, high-intensity sound of an unlubricated piece of massive marine machinery turning with violent force against dense, metal friction. The terrifying shriek rose in volume, intensified, and then simply stopped right at my bedroom door. The intense sound distortion was immediately followed by a terrifying, new, distinct noise, a single, high-pitched, clean, but entirely human gasp-me sigh of immense relief. Panic broke my self-imposed silence. I ran for the closest corner, terrified. The immense screaming had been an acoustic diversion for my eyes. Driven by a desperate need to stop the thermal siphon, I grabbed the closest physical item, a heavy piece of titanium pipe I used for simple maintenance, and rushed the cold, silent, immense basin. I drove the blunt steel end straight at the smooth, antique surface. The instant the pipe made full contact with the antique bowl, it was complete paralysis. The pipe struck the surface with an immensely loud, high-pitched, shattering clang. The single sound only amplified the sudden, complete silence that now enveloped my entire core home. I inverted the heavy metal sphere with immense, sustained effort. The interior polished surface was unnervingly warm, actively, physically hot to the touch, retaining all the house's life energy. And beneath it, still resting on the clean wooden surface of the heavy library desk, sat its terrible, simple final signature, a small, perfectly square, organized pile of salt. Nothing else. Just a pristine, high-density, simple pyramid of sodium chloride, protected from all of the surface condensation and atmosphere by the metal. I screamed, pulled the immense, heavy relic from the house, and immediately ran out of the front door, racing headfirst for the immensely cold, terrifying, chaotic, final destruction of the single massive downpour outside. I ran nonstop for the nearest permanent black granite cliff overlooking the endless, pounding open sea. There, with one enormous motion, I used both hands and my full, terrible body weight to throw the massive pewter sphere as far as I possibly could out into the absolute darkness and the final, crushing, black, cold maelstrom of the open ocean. I quit my quiet relic life immediately. The final, terrible terror of the shipwrecked beachcomber was a horrifying revelation. I hadn't found a ghost ship relic. I had simply found a thermal artifact, the permanent, intelligent, organized object of a final, long-dead sailor who froze to death. He had invented the single technological artifact of his own permanent human relief, a beautiful, simple, single thermal siphon that consumed all available heat source, and by bringing the perfectly preserved, massive, cold pewter orb home, I had simply become the single chosen human battery needed to reverse his eternal, terrible cold. Story 3. They hired me because the rest of the crew refused the bid. My task was to do the industrial demolition audit, checking the structural integrity and salvaging any remaining industrial architecture in an old, sprawling gas-fired electric power station in outside of Akron, Ohio. The plant, officially condemned years ago, was set for total demolition and was now a vast, cold expanse of disused turbines and decaying asbestos pipes, all contained within massive, wet stone walls. The part of the unit I focused on, the boiler room floor, was a chaotic, terrifying cavern filled with obsolete, 1940s-era coal-fired boilers, still leaking a persistent, black, slow stain of viscous fluid onto the slick, cement floor. The plant felt cold, deeply miserable, and intensely tired from a century of constant human pressure. My work schedule was simple, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., completely alone, under the constant, demoralizing drumming of a heavy Ohio rain that seemed to never let up. The atmosphere was immediate dread. The boiler room held the plant's core machinery, 4 immense, terrifying, 30-foot-tall steel tanks, permanently shut down, each the size of a single apartment. When the plant ran, their internal temperature was regulated by a single, tireless operator sitting below in a small, metal-walled maintenance booth, communicating his work only through a network of steam-driven intercom pipes. This man, the boiler operator, had done the shift so many times that his presence had become a permanent, low-level atmospheric artifact of the building's power grid. The oddity started passively. I was setting up my structural sensor equipment at 2 a.m. on a long, unlit steel catwalk positioned high above the row of immense, decaying boilers. The noise of the machinery itself was completely dead, a hollow, internal silence. But my handheld thermal camera immediately picked up an anomaly. The number 3 boiler, an immense, dark, steel cylinder 2 floors below, should have been completely ambient temperature cold. Yet, the screen registered a distinct, small, sustained area of high-intensity heat. Small, circular, and utterly concentrated, the heat signature was not radiating from the core steel, but directly from a single, rusted, immobile control valve on the left side, the valve the operator would have used to trigger the emergency pressure release. In the complete cold, it was glowing a deep, sickly white-hot. I assumed it was some strange pressure differential settling, but my sensor picked up something else when I moved closer. Above the cold, ambient drip of condensation and the faint sound of the outside rain, there was a new, terrible sound. Coming directly up from the single, small, steel-doored control maintenance shack below, where the old operator would have sat, I heard a clear whoosh of air and 2 distinct, perfectly organized clicks. The sounds were the low, perfect, rhythmic snaps of the old, black porcelain handles of the main internal intercom pipe system being carefully flipped to the on/talk position. Someone was down there, completely sealed off, turning the pipe system on now. I froze. I didn't dare turn my high beam on the room below. Through 2 minutes of complete, terrified silence, the humidity around me seemed to thicken, intensifying the cold of the external rain. A single, profound, terrifying sound came from directly inside the intercom pipe right next to my left ear, a short, clear, sustained burst of pressurized steam, followed quickly by a man's voice, deep, professional, and slightly irritated, the exact tone a tired man would use to talk to a supervisor 20 miles away. Maintenance? The thermal on Unit 3 just peaked. Pressure's up, boys. We need to throttle the main valve hard. You need to come down here to confirm that. The voice ended with a terrible, dry, high-pitched rattle, the sound of someone's old, tired lungs collapsing under the effort of physical speech. And then silence. I knew the man's identity immediately from a briefing photo. It was Earl, the final operator on the shift that killed 2 men in a pressure explosion decades ago just before the plant shut down. The plant, long dead, was now running its core machinery again. And the operator was still calling for maintenance for the disaster I had just located. I dropped my clipboard and ran straight down the catwalk steps, desperate to confirm the source and lock the control room down completely. When I reached the small, metal-walled control shack, I hammered on the heavy steel door. It opened effortlessly. The main door was unlatched and standing slightly ajar, just enough to make a subtle, internal squeak of brass. The room was empty. Clean. Dust-covered. Only the immense, cold silence of a building that had been dead for 10 years. But the single piece of physical equipment that mattered, the heavy-duty black porcelain telephone-like headset connected to the steam pipe communications system, was visibly disturbed. The headset was lying off its cradle, hanging precariously over the steel floor grating, swaying slightly, and radiating an intense physical cold, the cold of something deeply waterlogged with eternal exposure, despite the overwhelming dry dust everywhere else. I didn't try to look for Earl. I knew he wasn't a human. I immediately fled the boiler room entirely, racing out through the massive turbine hall structure and straight across the main yard, running hard towards the distant light of my foreman's temporary trailer, not bothering with the protocol or the paperwork. I didn't stop until I reached the locked safety of my personal vehicle parked 5 miles away. The final terror of the boiler operator's ghost was cemented when I read the internal report filed in the morning. As a result of a massive internal pressure release, the plant registered a minor explosion. The incident report confirmed one crucial, physically impossible detail. A small, critical control valve on the decommissioned Unit 3 had been physically wrenched outward, damaged beyond repair by an uncalculated, tremendous amount of internal steam pressure that had somehow erupted in Unit 3's cold boiler unit. The valve failed completely. The final line said the foreman blamed the maintenance crew for per protocol management allowing too much residual pressure in the pipe system. I quit the job the next day. The plant needed heat and attention and an eternal human presence to keep the terror at bay. The ghost wasn't a warning, it was a permanent, furious manager of trauma, still calling for help on a dead pipe system, unwilling to give up the immense responsibility. My final thought is a low, sickening dread, wondering if I have to answer the pipe. The ghost is still on the line, perpetually waiting for someone to respond to the final, terrible emergency. How to reverse the human mistakes of a century ago and stop the relentless, terrifying growth of pressure from the past. Story 4. Back in the late 90s, before smartphones ruined true silence, the old, towering fire lookout post nestled high in the Payette National Forest in rural Idaho was one of the loneliest and most isolated jobs in America. 2 solid months of existential sensory deprivation. I'd taken it one summer for the escape. All you had was a small, 3-foot square, glass-walled cabin surrounded on all 4 sides by the wind, the clouds, and the complete, profound, consuming darkness of the high forest. The total silence was only broken by the immense, chaotic howl of the sudden, brutal, cold, non-stop rainstorms that would wash the entire perimeter of the sheer mountain face for days on end. My single lifeline, an absolute psychological necessity for me, was a high-intensity, external, continuous perimeter lighting array positioned exactly 30 feet below me around the base of the massive pine poles, my watchtower light out. The chaos began on a particularly miserable, completely silent, utterly black night. The power source for the massive structure was absolutely stable, the silent drone of the generators far below a reassuring hum. But the ring of lights, all 20 massive, high-powered yellow bulbs that defined my secure perimeter, suddenly failed. Perfectly, simultaneously, silently gone. Total, absolute, organized darkness descended, leaving the entire vertical space beneath me in a deep, consuming blackness that had no beginning and no end. I immediately grabbed my emergency short-range radio to check the backup system, frantically trying to communicate the massive, singular failure. All I heard was the internal static and the frantic, high-pitched thrum of my own rapid breathing inside the small, enclosed operating cabin. The fear of deep, sudden vulnerability was paralyzing. The sound that followed from the metal base of the tower confirmed immediately that the power loss was deliberate. From the massive, cold, cylindrical, vibrating steel base of the structure directly below my glass-walled cabin, a precise, faint, organized scarystory click sound began, a subtle, but mechanical friction no human should be able to make. It was the clear, rhythmic sound of a full, heavy metal latch being slowly, meticulously, and fully drawn back off a locked metal door below, followed by the soft, high-pitched, slow creak of the immense, vertical maintenance hatch being smoothly, painfully pulled open. The slow, intentional manipulation of the immense, sound-dampened machinery came from the absolute core of the massive isolation zone. Something massive had ascended directly to my point of isolation now just to announce its presence. My terror broke. I swung my full, high-intensity emergency spotlight down the vertical axis of the metal cage. On the small, exposed, square steel platform that surrounded the main staircase, nothing. Only bare wind, wet, dark steel, and total silence. But the terror did not stop. From immediately behind me, from the absolute blackness of the heavy fog-covered forest, the sound was now amplified inside my own structure, a rhythmic, soft, immense, organized, continuous tapping on the exterior glass on the left-hand window. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was slow, persistent, deliberate, utterly non-threatening, and profound. The slow, rhythmic sound continued for 2 terrifying minutes of silence without a single pause, completely defying the immense horizontal winds and aggressive downpour that were battering the far side of the tower. I realized with a sudden, freezing chill that the tapping was only sounding when I had turned my light source away from the immediate threat. I threw the light suddenly to the left, bathing the window in full, eye-cracking white light. Nothing. Only slick, wet glass and immense, profound isolation. I spun completely back around to the first threat, the open doorway, and the second, terrifying surprise hit me, the entire ring of security perimeter lights. All 20 massive yellow bulbs, abruptly flared to life. A simultaneous, precise, immense flash of full, blinding, integrated yellow light that completely dissolved the darkness around the base of the entire structure in a blinding, terrifyingly organized burst of sheer optical intensity. 10 full seconds of painful light continued before the colossal structural failure instantly consumed the entire electrical supply. The entire array failed immediately and permanently. A loud, rhythmic stream of Zapop, WHINE, came over the internal speaker, followed by the immediate, final, total, absolute, eternal darkness. I screamed and collapsed into the center of my floor, curled up beside the massive, dead control panel. I finally understood the terror of Watchtower Lightout. This wasn't an organic monster. It was a massive, concentrated, sentient presence of organized darkness, a literal physical manifestation of the infinite void surrounding me, determined and capable of consuming any external light source that dared to challenge its permanent domain. The terrifying tapping sound was its way of distracting me, while its massive physical form reached out from the darkness of the high fog to seize and physically manipulate the power grid at the base of my tower. The immediate, coordinated, full-blown, final blast of light was its single message. It had consumed, mastered, and annihilated my only lifeline and was a permanent, massive part of the dark structure now. I bailed off the post at 5 a.m., using the emergency rope line to rappel down the wet, freezing tower base and immediately fleeing my post entirely, never climbing another isolated staircase in my entire life. The final check by the supervisor found nothing wrong with the base generators, only the entire main electrical light board was burned out, completely annihilated by a massive, concentrated, internal, overvoltage energy spike. The massive light failure had no logical cause. My final, cold horror, I realized the entire mountain base was entirely consumed by the pure, terrifying, concentrated absence of external human light, waiting for me to turn off my flashlight one final time, confirming its absolute final, total power. Story 5. I found my terror in a mirror that was supposedly too old to exist in the world around it. I had rented a cheap, small, dark corner apartment in an absolutely ancient section of East Harlem, New York, all pre-war brick, intense condensation, and a constant, profound airless isolation that made the whole space feel perpetually heavy and cold. The flat came entirely unfurnished, save for one terrifying, magnificent antique relic, a huge, 5-foot-long, mahogany-framed mirror, deeply set into the wall of the small, dark front hallway, facing the front window. The mirror was massive, thick, intense, and deeply scratched, with a single sheet of silver plating beneath the clean, unbroken glass. My rental contract had a specific, terrifying clause: must not be moved or altered from the front hall wall. Ever. This was the focus of the mirror has always been on. My passive terror began within the first week. The cold, relentless, pounding rain of the sustained coastal storm had set in, sealing me in the quiet darkness of the hallway. During my evening routine check, as I stared into the magnificent, old, deep mirror, running my fingers over the intricate, simple carvings on the heavy, dark frame, I noticed a change in the internal reflection. The mirror reflected the small, continuous width of my internal hallway perfectly, but set back deep into the internal reflected hallway, far past the reflected white door frame of my bedroom, a terrifying, intense, completely visible reflection of a completely different object had appeared in the smooth, silver glass. It was a massive, dark chest of drawers, intricate, massive, high-backed and completely immovable, that blocked the mirrored reflection of the back section of my apartment. It did not exist physically in my apartment. No item of furniture that large could fit down my small hallway. It was an object of pure, contained, physical unreality being reflected into my singular line of sight. The moment my eyes actively perceived the sudden change in reality, the reflection moved. The mirrored image of the dark, physical chest of drawers silently, smoothly, dissolved, slowly retreating completely back into the perfect, seamless, mirrored continuity of the hallway wall. The reflection was restored to the perfect background of my white, painted hallway wall, entirely unbroken. Total obedience. But my visual sense was now permanently corrupted. I knew of the massive, solid, immovable object that now existed in the final dark section of my mind. The horror was simple. The mirror was not a reflective surface. It was a precise, clear window onto a long dead past, a moment when the antique furniture had been perfectly positioned right where I stood. I had been reading the complex historical surveys of my building's structural background, trying to find an explanation for the bizarre, unmoving frame. Suddenly, the image changed. The glass in the mirror, while I was only a foot away, filled completely with immense, concentrated, aggressive, high-pitched white static, a chaotic maelstrom of purely visual frequency distortion. The immense noise of the visible static completely dominated my quiet apartment for 5 full seconds, and then, completely vanished. The clean, silver-flat surface of the mirror was entirely restored. But in the brief, terrifying, chaotic moment, I saw it, perfectly resolved in the final moment of the static collapse, a terrifying series of still, complete, unmoving human faces. Faces I did not immediately recognize, framed in old clothes, all staring directly out of the smooth, unblinking surface of the glass at my shocked, illuminated face. The faces were all distinct, complete, and terrifyingly angry. They were the angry spirits of every single original occupant of that immense, ancient apartment, preserved by the smooth, deep glass. I backed up slowly from the line of the angry faces into the center of the silent living room. I contacted the external management immediately. I told them of my visual distress and my complete resignation from the lease. My call was cut off in 3 minutes, immediately replaced by the clear, high-pitched monotone sound of my own voice screaming, followed quickly by a rhythmic, cold, sustained drumming sound coming from the deep end of the hallway behind the large mirror. The rhythm was slow, organized, and entirely focused on a continuous, physical action. I was entirely compromised. I made one final terrified check. I raced back up to the immense mirror and forced my face against the smooth, cold glass. The massive, angry faces were gone. but positioned behind one terrifying, thin, dark crack in the plaster right at the right lower corner of my reflection. A single, clear, still image appeared in the unmoving reflection. A thin, long, immensely dark wire had been neatly tucked, perfectly hidden, set just barely out of sight behind the frame, running horizontally across the painted plaster surface, entirely invisible to my real eye. The wire was a simple, small power conduit. The final terrifying revelation hit my exposed terror with a profound intensity. The mirror in my small apartment was not an antique relic, and it did not passively reflect the silent chaos around it. It was a perfectly still, electronically powered visual display, designed entirely to actively project an image to its single, human observer. The mirror's terrifying job was simple. It had been on since its first installation, projecting the single, final images of the eternal, fixed presence of the apartment's entire dead cast of terrifying memory, the perpetual reflection of all the screaming faces of the long-dead permanent occupants it was installed to preserve forever. I fled the apartment immediately, tearing out of the cold, dark building and leaving everything I owned to the permanent, oppressive stillness inside, fully abandoning the keys and the terrible mirror to the absolute dark. The final terror of the mirror has always been on was simple. I was finally safe from the screaming faces on my wall. But now, every single time I cross past the store window or a clear metal reflection, I find myself compulsively checking the immense, still, silver-flat glass. I am terrified, profoundly and fully consumed by the absolute dread of finding a new reflection of my old, forgotten memories staring back directly at me, confirming that the endless electronic power wire of the permanently installed, terror-fueled mirror has simply rediverted its single source, perpetual power to my own personal digital viewing space. Story 6. Up Interstate 40 in the isolated, high, cold plateaus of the central Arizona desert, the absolute darkness is broken only by the intense, cold, constant, rhythmic downpour of massive, isolated rainstorms, the kind of environment that strips away your mind's internal defenses. I was heading due west after midnight in my heavy-duty, long-haul four-wheel drive pickup, completely alone in the immense, consuming wilderness, listening to the monotonous, dense rhythm of the tire slap on the wet, black asphalt. My concentration was completely exhausted, my eyes completely glazed over by the long hours of driving. I was praying for an electrical storm, anything, to break the monotony. So, when I saw the flashing light in the immense, profound distance, right on the central, median line of the dead highway, I hit the brakes with an absolute, violent, physical jolt. It was perfectly clear in the complete blackness of the rain-washed open space, a solitary, powerful, perfectly red traffic light. Not a sign on a pole, not a signal flare, nor any kind of known municipal lighting, just a single, isolated, 300-foot-tall, perfect traffic light hanging impossibly high in the precise center of the two-lane road system. The light itself was dead. Completely black, red, yellow, and green bulbs completely unlit, static, and completely unhinged over the cold, wet asphalt. There is no side road here, no town, no intersection. My rational mind screamed at the single, final, solid truth of the physical impossibility I was facing. I slammed the truck into park, pulling the heavy, wet steel door open, and stepped out directly into the immense, cold downpour, ignoring the shock and the immediate exposure. I had to physically confirm what structural element of total reality I was encountering. The rain was instant full-volume white noise around my body. My heavy-duty lamp fixed its beam on the massive, single, metal tower holding the light apparatus. The structural reality was true, a towering piece of impossibly old, immensely high-tension metal, permanently placed in the isolated dirt valley. As I stared at the dense, wet, cold steel structure, absolutely hypnotized by the sheer logic defiance of the massive, single, organized structure, a light turned on inside the high, isolated head of the apparatus. But it was not the green to move, nor the red to stop. A single, powerful, brilliant blue bulb, located precisely in the small rear section of the structural casing that usually holds the high-intensity light for internal service alerts, suddenly flickered on. Not a continuous light, but a frantic, short, repetitive flash. 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 The high-colored blue light, intensely concentrated by the dark internal machinery, illuminated the dense, chaotic, persistent rain in strange, rapid bursts of intense, saturated color, creating an immense, artificial strobe effect in the quiet, desolate valley. The blue light only seemed to flash when my mind actively focused on the single structural anomaly of the physical existence of the light itself. I began to walk toward the impossible, immense signal through the chaotic, slick mud of the road shoulder. My body was driven by the single, terrifying lure of the precise, non-negotiable blue light. Blue for water, for impossible space, for deep, immediate, organized cold. The intense blue light was the final, direct message of the entity, the total suspension of the expected reality. As I closed the distance, I was 20 feet from the massive supporting cable. I heard a sound that terrified me more than the light. A profound, wet, low-frequency slap slap slap. The massive, cold, wet rhythmic sound of something immense and immensely heavy gently and carefully pulling itself completely free from the packed, slick mud and rain-wet sand directly behind the main concrete support column. The sound was slow, immense, wet, rhythmic, deliberate, and entirely unhindered by the overwhelming, powerful density of the horizontal downpour. It was only 3 steps. Slap, slap, slap. Followed by utter, cold silence. The object was massive, wet, and now fixed in place 4 feet away from me. I spun around instantly, sweeping the high-intensity light across the base platform. Nothing. Only the immense, chaotic mud surrounding the single base of the wet steel column. As I stood there, utterly immobilized by fear, the entire massive column of the single, perfect 300-foot-tall structure began to tremble violently against the heavy wind. The metal structure was shaking with an overwhelming, terrifying, localized, rhythmic pulse, transmitting the total feeling of an organized, contained internal struggle to the wet asphalt beneath my rigid, immobilized feet, sending an intense, powerful vibration directly up my rigid frame. The structure was violently struggling to survive under the colossal structural stress. A single, final, terrifying sound issued from the interior of the metal housing of the traffic light apparatus, delivered not by the speaker of the traffic light but by the immediate, vibrating, internal metal of the traffic pole. A high-pitched, sustained, aggressive rushing hiss, the sound of an immense volume of compressed, charged air violently exhaled. And immediately on top of the compressed air sound, a single, authoritative, terrifying male voice rose high in pitch, sounding entirely contained by the immense steel circumference of the vertical pole itself. "Your time is over, Mark. The sequence is complete. You must stop here now." The intense pressure on the air ended. The high, vertical structure completely, instantly failed. With a massive, tearing, agonizing internal shriek of strained metal being violently ripped apart, the single, tall mass toppled completely, violently collapsing across the exact path of my entire highway lane. The final silence was immense, followed by one single final, terrible sound, the rhythmic, high, chaotic, repetitive, precise tap-tap-tapping of the single blue light flashing frantically on the mud-covered top plate. I didn't wait to see what had been released from beneath the pole. The utter, absolute structural hostility of the backroad stoplight had simply won the complete control over my single space for good. I ran hard back to the truck and drove off-road for 2 full hours in the deep, dark, and chaotic elements, entirely consumed by the fact that the powerful, rhythmic rain had simply acted as a shield for what was below, an intense, sentient, organized demon of engineered, manufactured, perfect delay. A lethal creature whose entire single purpose was to use an absurd structural element to forcibly stop all physical commerce permanently at that terrifying spot on the empty, desert road. My presence was simply an unfortunate side effect. The blue light had chosen me to be the final, last living witness to its horrific, complete, absolute structural power over the engineered world. Story 7. My new house in suburban Portland, Oregon, wasn't haunted with ghosts. It was afflicted by noise. I took the job as a junior history professor at Portland State, moving into a cheap, small, multi-unit building in a quiet, densely built neighborhood. The man living directly above me, apartment 4B, the top floor, sounded like a massive, uncontrolled elephant at all hours of the day. A constant, low-frequency, physical thumping, dragging, and banging on the floorboards directly over my ceiling dominated my entire experience. I was convinced he spent his whole life dragging oversized furniture and dropping industrial tools. After 3 months of sleep deprivation due to the chaos, I finally complained to the management, which led to the absolute, terrifying truth. The apartment above mine had been completely empty and unsold for a full fiscal quarter. It was utterly vacant. The sudden realization that I was dealing with a massive poltergeist and not a rude neighbor was paralyzing. Being an academic, my first response was to analyze the phenomenon. The sound was loudest, most chaotic, and most relentlessly present between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., especially during the long, coastal storms that rattled the old, poorly insulated building, the apartment above the silence. I was trapped between my need for sleep, my professional skepticism, and a localized sound terror that had no human source. The constant, physical thrum of the heavy rain on the roof, far from being relaxing, seemed only to amplify the noise beneath it. I installed a high-sensitivity, omnidirectional microphone set to record all audio for future scientific documentation. The data was horrific, a sustained, organized volume of noise that completely defied the material science of an empty, single-unit apartment. The key element of the noise was not the random banging, but the distinct, physical sound of a continuous, slow drumming. Not a light touch, but the measured, heavy, rhythmic pang-pang-pang of a single, thick, wet human fist repeatedly being smashed violently onto a single spot on the bare wood floorboard, followed by a faint, wet drag motion that suggested the object, or hand, was being slowly withdrawn before the next smashing sound. The sound terror was focused entirely on a single circle of rough wood 2 feet from the internal perimeter of my own bedroom wall. My terror deepened the following night when the entity decided to acknowledge my listening presence directly. I was alone, sitting absolutely still in the dry, quiet center of my living room, only listening to the recorded playback from the night before, trying to find a pattern. The low, heavy, constant thumping from upstairs, the sound of the floorboards being hammered, suddenly dropped in volume a full 50%. The violent drumming was no longer there. In its place, a low, concentrated, strained human male whisper was audible on the upstairs floor. The voice wasn't speaking full words, but simple emotional articulations of complete, profound, existential desperation. I can't stop the pain. I cannot get down. My hands hurt so much. Get down, please, get down. The whole stream of sound was delivered entirely through a series of terrified, low, quick, rhythmic exhales of painful, short breath. The breathing pattern was too fast, too controlled, too broken for a normal sleeper. It was the sound of a prisoner trapped inside a tight space, using the limited air volume of a force chamber to communicate his singular pain. Fear gave way to action. I realized the banging was not aggression. It was a desperate attempt at vertical communication, an absolute cry for help from a trapped force trying to communicate the physical pain it was suffering from beneath the heavy, constant pressure of its own physical exertion. I ran upstairs, hammered on the locked door of 4B, and screamed at the utter silence inside too. "Stop the noise! It's empty! Why are you still there?" I ran back down, locking myself inside my own apartment for protection. But here came the terrifying final truth. The sound did not come from upstairs. When I sat for hours listening, my terror-filled ears finally understood the auditory deceit. The constant, repetitive, rhythmic thump-thump-thump did not originate from above. It was a massive, profound, violent sound effect being generated solely inside the air conditioning unit below my own unit. A localized, massive sound trap set in the old system's substructure, designed to trick me into turning my eyes upward. The sound was perfectly channeled through the old ventilation system piping and amplified just above my head. I had been focusing on the floor above me while the actual supernatural phenomenon was already in my flat. I reached for my phone for a quick call to the police. Just as I unlocked it, I heard the final, terrifying sound in my own dark hallway, mere feet from my position, the single, unmistakable, physical drip-drip-drip of thick, heavy, industrial-grade hydraulic fluid. The dripping was slow, rhythmic, audible, hitting the bare wood 3 perfect times. The floorboards, now visible under the dim hallway light, carried a slow, terrible, black oil spill, slowly spreading out from the central area of the floor near the thermostat and right towards the main exit. The smell of high-pressure hydraulic fluid and burnt chrome grease, thick and bitter, immediately assaulted my nostrils. I fled the apartment immediately, escaping out the fire escape door and sprinting hard for the all-night coin-op laundry 2 blocks away, leaving the heavy phone and everything I owned in that small, cursed, empty space. I didn't care about the academic career. The final terror of the apartment above the silence was a profound, cold, logistical dread realized. The banging I spent 3 weeks trying to escape was not a trapped human, but a trapped piece of massive, ancient, hydraulic machinery that had somehow become spiritually possessed, locked in an ongoing cycle of crushing an invisible thing against its chest right underneath the top-floor apartment. The final terrifying act of the apartment was to simply complete its internal structural leak, flooding my apartment with the viscous lifeblood of its mechanical, demonic possession, ensuring my body would never make a silent, clean escape and forcing me to become an unwanted new human component in its terrifying, loud existence. Story 8. I never liked crowds, but sometimes running corporate errands in the high-density areas of downtown Chicago is just mandatory. My terror began simply during the lunch hour rush while walking fast through the immense, humid, low-lit chaos of the central financial district. I was crossing a massive intersection, completely swamped by a sudden, intense burst of a high, chaotic, non-stop downpour. The feeling was instant, a profound violation of my entire personal reality so potent it made me physically stop in the middle of a massive green light, forcing the oncoming rush to violently maneuver around my frozen body. I knew, with absolute certainty, as a massive car horn blasted in my ear, that I had just seen him. Standing a mere 20 yards across the street, waiting at the edge of the curb with an unnerving, absolute stillness, wearing a thick, deep blue raincoat identical to my own, was the singular, perfect, physical doppelganger of my own body. He was entirely silent, his posture completely rigid, his features a perfect, high-resolution mirror of my own exhausted, stressed-out executive face. His stance was completely wrong for the scene, isolated, completely motionless, utterly oblivious to the massive storm raging around him. He was a silent, clean, total portrait of my physical self, standing out in the chaos of the immense public space to deliver one final, terrifying message. The man was not looking at the street or the oncoming traffic. His gaze was fixed perfectly, intently, and entirely backward into the reflection of the massive, mirrored, sheer wall of the skyscraper that lined the rear of the avenue. His eyes were wide, and in the sheer optical power of the dense glass, entirely fixed on an image that did not reflect back to the visible world. I was driven by a deep, insane human compulsion to understand the motive before the physical scene broke me. What does he see? I started to move, walking slowly but deliberately forward, forcing myself against the dense crowd, determined to confront my terrifying reflection in the street. The massive figure responded immediately. As I closed the distance by mere feet, trying to maintain eye contact with the perfect copy, the man suddenly, silently moved. He broke his perfect isolation and walked rapidly, stiffly, silently, out into the dense, black rush of the chaotic noon traffic, directly against the traffic flow, moving with an unnerving, organized, aggressive purpose towards the center lane line. I watched in absolute paralysis as the figure continued his deliberate, violent procession. He didn't check the traffic. He navigated around the passing buses and cars with the incredible, focused precision of a machine that had perfectly calculated every millisecond of its single trajectory. No car hit him. He crossed the initial flow and stopped precisely on the center line of the double yellow divider, poised impossibly still, waiting for the massive flow directly opposite the initial impact to engage its full, terrifying momentum. I screamed and broke into a full, panic-filled run, completely abandoning all human fear of traffic and physical consequence. I launched myself into the sheer chaos of the full traffic stream, fighting against the density of the enormous, chaotic flow, crossing 4 different terrifying lanes of immense, moving physical steel, all to intercept the terrifying focus of my double on the center line. He was standing there, immensely still, waiting for the massive, opposing traffic flow to begin its lethal, synchronized, terrifying move. I was 3 feet from him, yelling one full stream of frantic, nonverbal terror. My double, the doppelganger in the crowd, turned abruptly to face me. His immense, identical features were completely devoid of malice. But then, as he stood before me, the eyes, exactly my shade of dark blue, intensely and fully started to fill with immense, organized, cold, clear water. The immense liquid volume of his tears, an entire immense volume of clear water, streamed down the absolute stillness of his cheeks, filling his smooth face with immense, palpable aquatic distress. The entire display of profound, non-stop physical sobbing had no human vocal source. The crying doubled its intensity immediately. The physical distress of the weeping simply intensified violently, right as the immense opposing traffic flow was about to begin its single, coordinated, lethal move. My double didn't flinch. He spoke one single word, but the sound was strangely loud, clean, and perfectly calm, a completely unamplified, quiet human voice that defied the entire sonic presence of the ambient city and the deep, pervasive sound of human fear being thrown high into my hearing. The word was plain, clean, and full of immense, chilling wisdom. Leave. The only honest reflection is behind me now. I didn't try to touch him. I dove under the small 4-foot overpass structure that contained the traffic light control system, crawling into the narrow, cold, damp, completely dark undercarriage, collapsing into the immense heat and comfort of the sudden, total absence of visual stimulation. The doppelganger's command was simple, final and precise. I lay there in the cold, wet, absolute darkness for 2 full hours, listening only to the immense, chaotic scream of the intense rain. In the immense chaos, 2 things became absolutely clear to my mind. The double was a complex, organized phenomenon that utilized its brief appearance to force a chaotic, life-or-death intervention. And secondly, the final word was real. The image he was staring at, my complete, accurate, unblinking image that contained the terror to force me onto the center line, did not exist on the busy street. But it was only behind him, in the vast, immense reflection of the glass, a complete, unshielded visual record of the entire urban core that contained a perfect, terrifying visual image of the precise moment of my life's most terrifying mistake. I quit the job the next day. I stay entirely out of traffic and completely out of high-density areas that are covered in immense glass reflection. The doppelganger in the crowd wasn't a violent attacker. He was a silent, weeping, physically impossible reflection of the complete, utter human failure that I had completely suppressed, given a precise, human body, forced out onto the chaos of the dangerous open stage of the world, whose terrible power and pure existence were only made possible when a massive force of ambient chaos and high humidity fully condensed onto the smooth plane of the city glass and the simple fabric of my own uniform. Story 9. The American West is full of places where the land is brutally empty for hundreds of miles, and old, dead concrete structures stand silently to remind you of that fact. I'm a landscape photographer, and 2 years ago, I was driving through the deepest, hottest, most desolate section of the Mojave Desert near Death Valley. It was late afternoon, and the sky had turned into a thick, threatening bruise of a low-pressure system, something I knew from experience would produce a flash flood. My only point of interest on that long, dead road was a derelict concrete scenic overlook, an old 1960s roadside viewpoint that jutted out over an enormous canyon basin, utterly isolated and untouched for what must have been decades. The concrete was cracked, the iron railings were almost entirely corroded, and the sheer emptiness of the place, combined with the low, ominous cloud cover and the high, whipping wind, felt intensely hostile. I set up my tripod right on the edge of the crumbling concrete abutment, pointing my high-resolution digital camera straight west, hoping for a single, perfect, atmospheric shot of the coming storm. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, intense sound of the small granules of sand being driven against my jacket by the incessant wind. I took the first set of test shots. Everything was mundane, stark, and beautiful in its bleak way. I adjusted my f-stop for a low-light exposure and took a single, long 1-minute shot, letting the camera's sensor absorb the dim, violent light of the angry sky. When the photo appeared on the back of the camera's LCD screen, I immediately noticed the huge, distinct anomaly that completely broke my sense of space. The photo I had just taken, facing a perfect, empty landscape 1,000 feet high, with absolutely no point of human reference or visual structure, contained 3 distinct, still, highly detailed human silhouettes. Not shadows. Not distortions. 3 full, life-sized human figures, standing 30 feet from my camera, positioned on the far edge of the concrete overlook, staring silently and intently, not at the canyon, not at the camera, and not at the imminent storm. They were staring directly out toward a physical point on the sky where a second, completely unseen and unphotographed sun was now visibly, impossibly setting. I scrambled up, my breath caught in my throat, staring at the small, pixelated image on the screen, rubbing my eyes with shaking hands, utterly confused by the impossible artifact. I looked past my camera. The 3 human figures, now rendered with terrifying clarity on the digital display, did not exist in real time. The concrete in front of me was empty, stark, and utterly devoid of human life. The sky was an endless expanse of angry purple and gray, with 2 sets of human figures occupying 2 entirely separate versions of reality, the physical version, and the one that my long exposure photo had somehow recorded from the past. I tried to dismiss it, light bleed, lens flare, a digital software glitch in my very expensive, professional camera. But the forms were too clear, too well-defined, too perfectly human. 1 man, 1 woman, 1 child, all of them wearing heavy, archaic, 1960s touring clothes. The intense, oppressive heat of the desert day suddenly felt cold. Driven now by a morbid desperation to disprove the image, I hit the shutter again, this time reducing the exposure to only 10 seconds. The result was instantaneous and worse. The new photograph did not show the 3 figures in the same static, silent position. The figures in the photograph had moved. The man, still standing, had now tilted his head in an attitude of intense concentration. The child was pointing. The woman was now clutching a small, leather tourist cap, holding it tightly against the harsh, high-velocity side wind depicted in this new photo. The silent human drama of the still photograph had a distinct narrative. The figures in my lens were reacting silently and visibly to an immense, external atmospheric disturbance. A storm. But not my storm. Theirs. A storm that had happened here 50 years ago, captured perfectly and frozen in time, its human protagonists now stuck in a permanent, terrifying photographic loop I was accidentally viewing. My professional curiosity was now fully overridden by a desperate, deep animal panic. I did one final, 30-second exposure, aiming the camera's lens down not at the landscape but at the crumbling, yellowed concrete flooring of the overlook itself. I needed to see what these people were a part of. The resulting photo showed a clear, undisturbed shot of the floor, and situated perfectly beside the massive, cold, concrete plinth that marked the canyon's geographic location, was a perfect, shiny, full, large piece of chrome, the front bumper of a 1960s Ford Woody station wagon, polished to a mirror shine, parked precisely, intentionally, impossibly on the pedestrian-only walkway. In the reflection of the chrome grille, I saw 2 things: the bright, white flash of an identical camera's flash bulb, exactly where I had placed my tripod, reflecting the light of an entirely different camera's flash, and in the reflection of the clear, blue Arizona desert air behind our identical cameras, 2 huge, immense, black storm clouds boiling in precise, physical, identical opposition. I ripped the massive, very expensive tripod from its concrete moorings, not caring about the precise, expensive machinery. The realization of the profound, simple, and terrifying truth of the roadside viewpoint was a full, absolute assault on reality. The spot I was standing on, the isolated, dead concrete slab, was not just a scenic point in physical space, but a precise meeting point of 2 entirely separate timelines, both focused on the same simple objective: capturing a single memory of a family outing right before a massive storm. And by using my modern, long-exposure digital camera, I had accidentally opened a direct, permanent, two-way visual link to a moment when the light and weather conditions almost exactly matched the event that had transpired there 50 years earlier. The terrifying implication of the final photo was horrifying, perfect, and clear. I screamed and fled the viewpoint, jumping into my empty truck and driving away as fast as the old machine would let me, never once looking in my rearview mirror for the bright, white flash in the dark that would confirm that the unseen, ghostly cameraman from 50 years in the past was finally and permanently taking my picture. I live back east now, and my days of desert photography are over entirely. The old camera, the SD card, sit at the bottom of a locked drawer in my closet, a final, horrifying digital testament to my singular terror, that some moments of perfect visual beauty and terror simply do not fade, and some final, terrible, synchronized moment in the desert light is still permanently, silently, waiting for the perfect observer to stand there as a final, living witness to that beautiful destruction. Story 10. The old Victorian home in Asheville, North Carolina, was beautiful, completely isolated, and utterly silent, a massive, sprawling architectural relic set in the rolling hills of the immense, cold, wet Blue Ridge Mountains. I had inherited it last winter after the cold, sudden passing of my uncle. Being remote and completely silent, it was the perfect place of solitude, a break from reality that I desperately needed. The one terrifying anomaly that existed in the total silence of the inherited home was the rocking chair's hum. It was a beautiful, small, very old mahogany rocking chair, positioned precisely outside the master bedroom closet on the second-floor landing. It was clearly antique, worn down smooth by generations of use, and utterly empty. The weather outside was atrocious. An immense, dense, cold, slow, relentless rainstorm had completely settled over the entire region, turning the dark mountains into a massive, monochromatic, gray wall of water. The sound of the torrential rain beating on the slate roof was a deafening roar that I tried to use as a comforting blanket against the intense, emotional isolation. My sensory breakdown began at 3 a.m., in the absolute, total, cold deep heart of the storm. The distinct, slow, agonizing, continuous creak of the antique rocking chair began, a sound of heavy, unlubricated wood grinding hard against the raw, unpolished, hardwood floor. The sound was impossible. The floor was flat, waxed, perfectly uniform, and the immense, heavy rain outside should have immediately and completely drowned out the low, physical friction of such a small sound. But the relentless, rhythmic, slow-starting sound of the rocker persisted, intensifying its friction, creating a slow, rhythmic, low-frequency pressure on my own terrified eardrums. I immediately grabbed my high-intensity flashlight and threw open the bedroom door. The precise, localized terror was immediately confirmed. The small cedar chair was completely, disturbingly empty. There were no vibrations in the entire floor around me, no structural elements were responsible, and there was no internal source of light or movement, only the high-fidelity, continuous creak of the slowly, peacefully rocking chair right in front of my own illuminated eyes. The empty piece of antique furniture was in constant, agonizing motion, completely defying inertia, friction, and the laws of total structural equilibrium. No force was present inside the dry, warm air of the internal hallway. Terror and logic warred inside me. I was completely alone in the isolated, empty, decaying mansion. I forced myself down the hallway, the sound of the rocking now filling my entire auditory world. I grabbed the chair on its wooden armrests with both hands and immediately engaged all of my strength in fighting the relentless, agonizing motion, desperately working to physically stop the chair's persistent, mechanical momentum. My muscle fibers strained with absolute, physical intensity. To my total shock, the motion was totally unstoppable. The simple, rhythmic action of the quiet rocking immediately and violently overpowered both of my strong hands, effortlessly shoving and throwing my entire body completely offline, throwing me back hard against the cold wall. The chair did not stop. It returned to its peaceful, slow, constant, unflagging rocking motion immediately after the physical force was removed. and the agonizing crack resumed. I realized I was fighting not a mechanical machine, but a powerful, absolute, pure source of unending psychic momentum. The chair's rhythm was not natural. It was the final, perpetual rhythm of a single, isolated, intensely focused, human thought. I stumbled back towards the bedroom, entirely defeated by the overwhelming, simple, physical supernatural force I had just encountered. I tried to sleep under those conditions. The continued rhythmic, constant creak was maddening. I finally resorted to my final scientific weapon. I wrapped the massive, heavy-duty wool blanket around a small recording microphone, hung the microphone over the upstairs banister, and forced the machine to record the precise audio. The playback confirmed the horror immediately. The relentless creak was a terrifying, perfect, rhythmic pattern of low-frequency sound. But underneath the sound of the physical stress, an immense, faint, deep, terrifyingly low-frequency drone was permanently laced. The massive, subterranean, simple sound was the constant, absolute heart rate of a single, very old, completely silent human, the heavy, constant rhythmic pounding of a massive organ beating slow life into a perpetual silence. The true horror of the rocking chair's hum was simple. The chair itself was the organ generator of the terrifying, eternal life it had been left in charge of maintaining. The terrifying force was the isolated, unending despair of my isolated, dead uncle, whose entire physical, emotional, deep psychic pain was now perfectly embodied in the perpetual, strong momentum of the empty chair, and transmitted to the world through the slow, terrifying, unlubricated squeal of the grinding, raw, mechanical wood. I abandoned the mansion immediately, leaving the full house's structural decay and the complete, endless human silence behind me. The final visual evidence of my flight was the last thing I saw in the dark. A vast, amorphous, white shape had settled softly, gently, directly onto the antique seat, and had immediately fallen headlong into the total, unending comfort of the chair's relentless, unflagging perpetual rhythm.